What are historical examples of don't pick fights you can't win? The Shah of the Khwarezm Empire humiliating and killing Genghis Khan's diplomatic envoys. A few years later, there was no Khwarezm Empire anymore. The Great Emu War. Germany declaring war on the USA while already busy failing to defeat the USSR. All the European powers of the time who declared war on Napoleon's France. It took 6 coalition wars just to get rid of him, 7 if you include Waterloo. He pretty much was wiping the floor with every empire. He even dissolved the Holy Roman Empire in the process, which had existed for 1000 years. Then amusingly, he picked a fight with Russia, a fight he couldn't win. I'd say the ancient Greek city of Thebes embodies this pretty well. Thebes kinda had a history of being the squeaky third wheel in Greek affairs. It was just kinda their thing. Persian War. Athens and Sparta defeat Persia. Guess which city-state allies with the Persians? Yup, Thebes. So Sparta responds by tanking Thebes' economy. But reneges once Spartan-Athenian relations begin to sour. They go back and forth in an alliance with Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. So after that war, there was a huge power vacuum, which ends up sort of accidentally being filled by Thebes. It really meant there wasn't anyone to say no, but soon after that, the Greek economy absolutely shat itself. Another recurring theme, and Thebes didn't have the military presence to maintain its economic empire. Flash forward to 335 BC. Macedon controls most of Greece and has a huge army. Alexander comes to power. Thebes, not knowing they were dealing with Great Alexander the elects to rebel against Alexander's newly inherited kingdom. Alexander responds as Alexander does. He takes the city, sells the population into slavery, and burns Thebes to the ground. The other Greek states saw this squeaky third wheel get put down and realized Alexander meant business, so they remained loyal to Macedon. Don't be like Thebes. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, which lasted 38 minutes. The small island of Zanzibar was a British colony at the time. The Sultan died, and the British had a hand-picked successor. But before this successor could arrive, the previous Sultan's cousin declared himself in charge instead and barricaded himself in the palace. Britain sent 5 ships and 1,000 men. The would-be Sultan had only his palace guard, his slaves, and whatever civilians he could gather. With one volley, the British forces completely disabled Zanzibar's only artillery batteries. They then marched for the burning palace, meeting only ineffectual potshots on their way. All told, there were 500 casualties on the Zanzibari side, and 1 wounded on the British side. The Paraguayan War of 1864-70. Paraguay vs. Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. Paraguay lost almost 70% of its adult male population, according to some estimates. Helping someone with transportation for 20 people for the church. CM Punk thinking he could walk into the UFC in his late 30s with no MMA experience. The Franco-Prussian War, also known as Franco-German War. It can be argued that the Germans provoked the attack, but France attacked and 6 months later the Northern German Confederation won. This then led to German unification and the crowning of the Kaiser. As the ultimate insult, they crowned William I in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, France. The invasion of the Italian peninsula by Pius of Epirus. He technically won his war with the Romans, but suffered such heavy casualties that the term Pyrrhic victory was coined. Anyone who fought Mike Tyson in his prime. Oscar Wilde taking the Marquis of Queensberry to court for calling him gay. I should state, the laws in the UK were immoral and terrible. The punishment Wilde got was excessively cruel, and the entire situation was horrible and an example of how absolutely terrible the Victorian era was for gay men. But he should not have tried to sue Queensberry just because his boyfriend told him to. Because 1. He wasn't in any legal trouble at that point. 2. The libel case against Queensberry dredged up all of the evidence that Wilde was, in fact, gay. And 3. This resulted in him going to court for all of the things he could have gotten away with if he'd left it alone. The don't get involved in a land war on Asia line from Princess Bride is pretty good advice. Afghanistan didn't become known as the graveyard of empires for nothing. Also Russia, especially in the winter. There are two classic blunders. The first is never get involved in a land war in Asia, and the second is never go against a Sicilian when death is on the line. No one talking about Everest Galois, a supreme mathematical genius that got involved into a duel in his 20s. Spent the whole night before the duel trying to calculate ways to win the duel and nothing worked. Roughly 500-600 BC, Croesus, king of Lydia, part of what is today's Turkey, credited with using the first state-issued and standardized gold coins for general circulation. He was also rich as duck. According to Herodotus, he asked some oracle whether it would be a good idea to attack Persia, and they answered something along the lines of, if you attack, you will be adding to a great empire or a great empire will be destroyed. I've heard both versions. Thinking this meant victory, he attacked. Well, as it turned out, the empire that was added to was Persia, and the one destroyed was his own. Persia then implemented his gold coin standard. Cambodia attacking Vietnam. See Mongol conquest of Khwarezmia for the perfect example of this. Mithridates and family. Mithridates was the king of Pontus. As a side note, he was so afraid of being poisoned that he dosed himself with small amounts to make himself immune. This will come into play later on. He was exasperated at the Romans ruling over what he viewed as his rightfully kingdom. So when the Romans' back was turned, he attacked the Roman towns in the area. Well, Rome wouldn't stand for it, so they sent an army and quickly beat them. Then a few years later, he tried it again. He even ended up beating a poorly trained Roman legion. But there were more important problems back at Rome that they didn't think he was important enough to deal with right now, and basically told him to stop where he was or they would be back. Well, he didn't stop. A few years after that he was at it again. Only this time Rome sent Pompey, who wiped the floor with them and then chased him to capture and return him to Rome. Well, Mithridates didn't want that, so he tried to kill himself. But remember how he tried to build an immunity to poison? Turns out it worked. He needed a servant to stab him. Well, a few years after that, Pharnaces, Mithridates' son, oh, you know what we haven't done in a while? Go to war with Rome. I'm sure it will work this time. It didn't. This time Julius Caesar was in charge, and he beat them so hard and quickly that he said his famous line, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I won. Well, he didn't actually say that then. He wrote it later when talking about the battle. So here's to Mithridates, a guy that was really good at starting a war with Rome, but not so good at finishing them. I'm surprised no one has mentioned the first Gulf War. The US military went in and destroyed the Iraqi military in days. Bush Sr. was smart enough to destroy the Iraqi military and then jet the duck out, unlike his offspring that entered us into a hellhole of ideological warfare. Russia in winter. But I'd say Cuba's first two wars for independence from Spain. Cuba has honestly never really been great as far as military goes. It's always been only as strong as its allies in combat. So the first two times when it declared war on Spain, it went pretty terribly. Cubans weren't well armed. Their medical supplies were low. Their hospitals were extremely unhygienic. Their military leaders often lacked training, experience, or really any form of military education, and the soldiers even less so. They relied heavily on guerrilla warfare in their jungle environment, which, spoiler alert, the Spanish were more than familiar with and capable of handling. Add to this, they weren't particularly big. They were one on the only, and eventually only, colony Spain had left, so any rebellion would be given the dying empire's undivided attention. Spain also had no qualms with other nations, so no European country was going to bail them out. And America was going through its own internal conflicts and expansion, so it helping out would be out of the question. Plus, Spain was technically not breaking the Monroe Doctrine, so America legally had no authority to intervene, nor would they want to at the time. They only managed it the third time because that conflict lasted long enough for America to declare war on Spain, with reasons not necessarily exclusive to helping Cuba. The War of 1812. A mere matter of marching A. Japan continuing to fight after Hiroshima. When the rogues picked a fight with the warriors. The Winter War between the USSR and Finland. The USSR thinks it can roll into Finland like it did in the Baltic states, and instead gets bogged down fighting a well-prepared Finland. Ends in a treaty with minor territorial adjustments. Huge embarrassments for the USSR. The Battle of Agincourt. Heavily armored French knights sounds like a great way to win medieval battles, until you go up against English longbows capable of punching holes in said armor like a wet sheet of paper. Fighting on two fronts during a world war. Looking at you, Hitler. Hannibal and Roman Empire. 1948 Arab-Israeli War. 6-Day War. Yom Kippur War. Germany in the first WW. Germany in the second WW. Thanks Austria. Someone else can give a better rendition than me, but definitely the story about the empire that sent an emissary to a kingdom looking to trade. The receiving kingdom beat up the emissary and sent him back. The emperor was like, okay, maybe they don't know who I am. Go send them again, but with a bunch of gold. The empire sends the guy again. The kingdom receives the guy again, but this time beheads him and keeps all the gold. Well, the emperor was either Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan. I'm shaky on the details and I often confuse the two men. Either way, they pissed him off, so he sent an army and basically wiped the kingdom off the earth in a mass genocide. I wish I could find a wiki of the actual story, because it's been on the tip of my tongue for a while, but I read it in an old AskReddit post and I haven't been able to find it. The Vietnam War. Let me count the ways. The French had given up before the USA entered the fight. The North was always unified politically and governmentally, while the South Vietnamese government was corrupt and torn by various factions. The leadership turned over a number of times when the USA first started to escalate our involvement in the mid-1960s. The USA thought we could win by superior firepower, by bombing them back to the Stone Age. General Curtis LeMay. We had no recognition that the North had the will to win, and was willing to play a long game, and sacrifice hundreds of thousands of citizens and Viet Cong soldiers to the cause, and the North and their allies were fully aware that American opinion was turning against the war, while Vietnam was a dictatorship. The USA is a democracy, and people vote against their leaders when they are dissatisfied. When Hitler tried to duck with Russia. You're not even mentioning Korea's fight against Japan, in which a few turtle ships versus 30 of Japan's best ships. The Koreans had one damaged ship and the Japans all had sunk ships. The War of 1812. Anyone? USA decides to invade Canada and Canada responds by burning Washington DC to the ground. Germany invading the Soviet Union in World War II. War of 1812. Good way to get your Capitol building burnt down. Anyone trying to conquer Afghanistan. Never launch a land war in Asia. Following the example of the time it kicked Greece's ass, Israel picked a fight with Rome. It also decided to pick a fight with Israel, and another fight with Israel for good measure. Turns out this was a bad plan. The Romans arrived to find Jerusalem besieging itself. Nazi Germany versus pretty much everybody at the same time, but mostly Nazi Germany versus the USSR. Hussein's Iraq invading Kuwait. No way was the West going to let that go. Russia. Winter. Don't do that. US invasion of Afghanistan. When the Ottoman Empire tried to invade Poland. Anytime a host civilization killed emissaries that were sent on behalf of the Mongol Empire. Seems like that never turned out well. The Romans built Hadrian's Wall to mark the end of what they considered civilization. They regarded as Scots as so barbaric it was not worth fighting us. Dwight D. Eisenhower decrying the military-industrial complex in the United States. 60 years later and it's worse than he could ever have imagined. Barbarossa invading Russia. Napoleon invading Russia. The Entente invading Russia. Hitler invading Russia. The Japanese Empire invading Russia. Case in point, don't start the land war in Asia. Any and all invasions of Russia. Philip and Alexander Hamilton. Anybody versus Russian winter. McGregor versus Mayweather. Too much talking on McGregor's part. Never get into a land war in Asia. Jerry West versus The Boston Celtics? Germany vs America. France vs Russia, Napoleonic. Mexico vs America. Paraguay vs literally half a continent. Germany and Japan in World War II. Germany declaring war on the whole world resulting in 60 million lives lost for nothing? Thinking I can't take on Taco Bell at 3 AM after a night downtown. Bird vs Randy Johnson's fastball. Both world wars, but especially the second. The Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire cutting off the heads of emissaries sent by Genghis Khan. Despite threats that there would be repercussions, the Khwarezmian Empire ceased to exist 3 years later. Chillin' dude beefing with Leffen in Super Smash Bros. Melee leads to a 1-5 Fox vs Fox set in the Salty Suite, Apex 2015. Money on the line is $1100. Chillin' dude loses to Leffen 0-5 and is rendered dumbfounded and exasperated. The MC, Bobby Scar, asks Chillin' dude if he has anything to say to the audience as Chillin' blankly stares forward, unable to recover his senses. Chillin' dude says, "My B." When the island of Zanzibar declared war to the United Kingdom in 1886, they abandoned 45 minutes later. Invading Russia in the winter. Japan v USA, December 1941. Stalingrad is an easy one. Anglo-Zanzibar War, Britain suffered 1 casualty. The Khwarezmida Empire, greed, is a terrible thing. How about those guys that bombed Pearl Harbor? Everyone who wasn't Russian who tried to invade Russia. Napoleon invading Russia during the winter. Germany vs Sikh Blyat Squad. Battle of Omdurman, Egypt and Britain vs Madhya Sudan. 400 casualties to 25,000 casualties, and 5,000 captured. Textbook showcase of being outmatched in weaponry. Invading Russia, never a good idea. The Battle of Poltava, the Winter War, the Six-Day War, Vietnam War. Invade Russia in the winter,